So I first want to start off by showing you a map of the Sahel, but apparently on the iPhone you can't flip the video while recording, so we're not going to do that. So let's describe it. So firstly, what is the Sahel? So the Sahel is geographic region. Let's see if I can maybe show it here. You can see my screen. I'm kind of showing blindly, but it is the area that it separates the North Africa, and specifically the Sahara Desert, from sub-Saharan Africa, which has a different temperate climate. And as of late, the Sahel, which if you can see it, it's this red area, it's been having a lot of terroristic activity from Islamic jihadists. But today we're specifically going to talk about this country right here, which is Burkina Faso. So Burkina Faso over this weekend had a coup. And this is interesting as this isn't the only coup they've had as of late. In fact, 8 months ago, they also had a military coup. And in West Africa in general has been having a lot of coups over the last 2 years. You had a military coup in Chad, in Mali, in Guinea. Additionally, you had an attempted coup that failed in Guinea-Bissau. So there's been a lot of coups in this region, which isn't good. So coups are essentially when some other entity comes in and removes by force the current governmental regime. So this is never good for the stability of a nation, and particularly this is not good for Burkina Faso. So you're probably asking yourself, why should I care about Burkina Faso? It doesn't involve me at all, and in a way you'd sort of be right. I mean, we don't really have a lot of economic ties to Burkina Faso, though there is some mining such as gold and other commodities. But the big reason to be paying attention to this coup is not necessarily for the direct economic effect, but what it essentially says about the whole Sahel region as a whole. So with this, I mean, so first it was talk about the clear instability. So this isn't good for many reasons. Already millions of people have been either displaced or affected by the violence throughout the Sahel, including within Burkina Faso. This year alone, thousands have been killed. And this just helps to trigger mass immigration towards Europe, which is a huge problem for the European countries, not so much here in the States because we have the giant Atlantic Ocean protecting us. But it definitely causes humanitarian issues that affect Europe. And then more importantly, from a geopolitical standpoint, well, not more importantly, I should say, but I guess rather poignantly, given the whole Ukraine war, what was interesting about this coup was the fact that there were Russian flags flying everywhere. There was a lot of pro-Russian protesters in the streets of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's capital, with signs saying like "Nous voulons Russie," which means like "Please come on, Russia," like "France dégage," which France essentially disengage. So there's a lot of pro-Russia sentiment and a lot of anti-France sentiment. If you're not familiar with the history of this region, France were the colonizers, so they've had historic ties going back forever. But people are getting particularly sick of the French, especially as there hasn't been a whole lot of progress made by the French in their helps with these Sahel governments in their fight against Islamic insurgents, which are just flourishing. They couldn't be doing better. In fact, 40% of Burkina Faso is out of control of the central government. It's in the control of these Islamic extremists. So a lot of people in the country aren't happy, and Russia in particular has been taking advantage of this. So during these protests, during this coup over the weekend, you could see Russian flags everywhere, which, just think about it, they don't really have like an Amazon. I don't think they have a Jumia, which is the African version of Amazon in Burkina Faso. But even if they did, given that these are some of the poorest people on the planet, do you think they'd really be spending their hard-earned dollars on buying Russian flags, which will have to be imported because they're not making a bunch of Russian flags within Burkina Faso? Of course not, right? So it seemed very suspicious, arguably staged, that there was just flags, Russian flags flourishing. Also ahead of the Wagner Group, which the Wagner Group is a Russian paramilitary organization that has direct ties to the Kremlin, and essentially, so countries such as like nearby Mali and Central African Republic, they hire the Wagner Group to take care of insurgents. But then the problem is you can't get these entities to leave because these are usually hired by weak governments who don't have the funds. So the Wagner Group personnel essentially stay and just rape and pillage, sometimes literally, and do whatever humanitarian disasters they want, and also stealing resources and commodities from the country, oftentimes in lieu of payment. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but it's very clear that Russia has been working via a lot of bots and on online social media presence to try and persuade the Burkina Faso residents away from France, which they have a right. They're rightfully a little angry because there hasn't been a lot of progress made. But Russia isn't going to really be able to do much either. And in fact, they could be worse in the long run than having France as assisters to your and trying to help with your Islamic issues, particularly as the Wagner Group won't leave. So it's definitely interesting. And again, like the Wagner Group, the head, he congratulated the new general, saying that he was a courageous son of Burkina Faso. You had another high-level diplomat in Russia congratulating the coup leader. So it's very clear that Russia is betting big on trying to get African countries to move on to their side and away from the West, which also brings to another point I want to mention, is that this weekend, if you were paying attention to Putin's speech on the annexation of the 4 territories, Zaporizhzhia, Luhansk, Donetsk, and I forget the other one. But so a lot of people, if you're in the West, your main reaction is this is just the rants of a madman. If you were in Russia, you probably were either felt it was a patriotic speech, or you're as terrified about the mobilization and probably give you further impetus to flee the country. But there was a huge audience that people in the West don't really realize, is that it was the rest of the world, particularly when Putin was discussing about Western colonization and the West having historically kind of raped and pillaged other lands. Particularly, he was very poignant about Britain's reign over India, for example. These all hit countries such as Africa. That's what this message is targeted towards, not towards the West. And a lot of Westerners, it completely goes over your heads. But this message that Russia is for these other countries that the Western colonizers previously and historically had done countless injustices to is clearly catching on. And that's why you should be paying attention to this, because this is kind of showing how Russia is heavily investing in building diplomatic relationships in parts of the world that pretty much the West, outside of France, is disengaged from. And this is not good long term, as by 2050, 1 out of every 4 people will be African. And also, Africa is the future with regards to its young labor force, which a lot of countries, including China and a lot of European countries, will be suffering from as more of their population becomes old age versus young, which you need a younger, huge swaths of younger age demographics to really help purport and fuel your economy. And also, there's just huge economic potential that could potentially be tapped instead by Russia if governments in the West don't pay attention to this. So I would continue paying attention to see if not only there are other coups, but to see if Russia and its direct proxy, the Wagner Group, make huge inroads not only in Burkina Faso, but in other African countries.